The first snow of December covered the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, Iowa. White flakes drifted gently onto rooftops, sidewalks, and the worn wooden bench where 72-year-old Harold Thompson sat every morning with a cup of black coffee. To most people, Harold looked like an ordinary old man who had fallen on hard times. His brown coat had faded after years of use. The sleeves were frayed, the buttons had been stitched back on more than once, and his boots had clearly seen better days. Every Thursday, he walked to the local grocery store instead of driving. The young cashier often smiled politely but looked at him with sympathy as he counted every dollar before paying. Harold never minded. Money had never defined him. In fact, very few people knew anything about his past. After losing his wife, Margaret, 5 years earlier, Harold chose a quiet life. He lived in a modest apartment, read books, tended flowers on his small balcony, and visited his wife's grave every Sunday with fresh white lilies. His only child, Emily, called every week. "Dad, are you eating properly?" Harold laughed softly. "I've survived 72 winters. I think I know how to cook soup." Emily smiled through the phone. "You always joke." Their conversations were warm, but Harold sensed something had changed since Emily married Jason Carter. Jason had built a successful real estate business before turning 40. He loved luxury watches, expensive cars, and designer suits. To him, success was something everyone should be able to see. Whenever Harold visited, Jason remained polite but distant. His eyes always wandered toward Harold's old clothes. His worn shoes. His aging coat. Harold noticed everything. He simply chose silence. One cold evening, Emily called again. "Dad. Jason's parents are hosting Christmas dinner this year." "That sounds nice. They'd like you to come too." Harold paused. There was something unusual in Emily's voice. Almost nervous. "Is everything all right?" Emily hesitated. I don't want anyone to make you uncomfortable." Harold smiled gently. "My dear, people can only embarrass you if you give them permission." Emily sighed. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too." After hanging up, Harold opened an old wooden chest beside his bed. Inside were neatly folded military uniforms, dozens of medals, faded photographs, and a leather folder sealed with the emblem of the United States Army. He looked at them for several seconds. Then quietly closed the lid again. "Not this Christmas," he whispered. On Christmas Eve morning, Harold stood before his closet. A brand new navy overcoat hung beside his old brown one. He reached for the new coat. Then stopped. Instead, he slowly picked up the old brown coat. He smiled to himself. Let's see how people treat a man they believe has nothing. Across town, Jason was speaking confidently with his parents. "My father-in-law is, well, harmless." His mother frowned. "What do you mean?" "He's one of those retired guys living on almost nothing. Emily keeps worrying about him." Jason laughed. "I just hope he doesn't make things awkward tonight." His father, Robert Carter, quietly looked out the window without saying a word. Something about Harold's name seemed strangely familiar. That evening, snow continued falling as Harold walked toward the Carter family's beautifully decorated home. Warm lights glowed through every window. Laughter echoed from inside. Harold adjusted his old coat, took a deep breath, and rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the door slowly opened. Jason forced a polite smile. "Oh. You actually wore that old coat." Harold smiled kindly. "Merry Christmas, Jason." Jason stepped aside. "Come in." None of them realized that before the night was over, one forgotten name from the past would change every life sitting around the dinner table forever. The warmth inside the Carter home stood in sharp contrast to the freezing wind outside. A towering Christmas tree sparkled in the corner, surrounded by neatly wrapped presents with golden ribbons. The scent of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and freshly baked cookies filled the air. Emily hurried to the front door and wrapped her father in a warm hug. "I'm so happy you came." Harold smiled. "I wouldn't miss Christmas with my daughter." Emily quietly noticed the old brown coat. She knew her father owned a beautiful new one, yet he had chosen the oldest coat in his closet. She didn't ask why. Jason led Harold into the living room, where several relatives were already chatting. "This is my father-in-law, Harold," Jason said casually. A few guests nodded politely before returning to their conversations. No one asked Harold about his life or invited him into the discussion. They were far more interested in talking about expensive vacations, luxury homes, and business investments. Harold simply sat in a corner with a gentle smile, listening more than speaking. Jason's younger brother leaned toward him. "So, are you retired?" "Yes." "What did you do before retirement?" Harold took a sip of tea. "I served my country." The young man assumed he had been an ordinary clerk or driver. "Oh, that's nice." Before Harold could say another word, someone changed the subject. Jason noticed everything and quietly smirked. To him, Harold seemed completely out of place among successful people. A few minutes later everyone gathered around the long dining table. Crystal glasses reflected the warm Christmas lights. The meal looked magnificent. As everyone took their seats, Harold naturally chose the chair nearest the end of the table. Jason whispered loudly enough for several people to hear. "That seat is probably the best choice." A few relatives laughed softly. Emily looked embarrassed. "Dad, please don't mind." Harold smiled gently. "I came here for family, not for chairs." His calm answer made Emily proud, but Jason simply shrugged. Dinner began. People talked excitedly about promotions, investments, and luxury cars. Jason proudly announced, "I just bought another lake house last month." Everyone congratulated him. Then he glanced toward Harold. "What about you, Harold? Any exciting plans?" Harold answered honestly. "I planted roses on my balcony last week. I hope they bloom in spring." The room fell strangely quiet. Someone forced a smile. Another person looked away. Jason chuckled. Simple dreams for a simple life. Harold didn't react. Instead, he continued eating peacefully. Robert Carter, Jason's father, watched the old man carefully. There was something familiar about Harold's calm voice, the way he carried himself, even the straight posture despite his age. Robert frowned slightly. "Have we met before?" The thought refused to leave his mind. After dinner, everyone gathered around the fireplace for coffee and dessert. Jason walked over carrying a tray. "Careful, Harold. Those cups are expensive." Harold looked at him kindly. "I'll be careful." Jason laughed. "I'd hate to lose a family heirloom." Emily finally couldn't stay silent. "Jason, that's enough." The room became uncomfortable. Harold gently placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "It's Christmas. Don't argue." Jason rolled his eyes and walked away. Across the room, Robert continued staring at Harold. Then his eyes suddenly fell on a small pin attached to the inside of Harold's old coat. It was barely visible. A faded military insignia. Robert's face changed instantly. His heart began beating faster. He slowly stood from his chair and walked toward Harold. Stopping just inches away, he looked directly into the old man's eyes. In a trembling voice, he asked, "Were you ever stationed in Germany?" In 1989. Harold slowly raised his head. For the first time that evening. His expression changed. The room fell completely silent. Even the laughter from the children decorating cookies in the next room seemed to fade away. Robert Carter stood frozen in front of Harold, his eyes fixed on the faded military insignia pinned inside the old brown coat. "Were you ever stationed in Germany, in 1989, he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. Harold looked up calmly. "Yes," he replied. "I was." Robert's breathing grew heavier. "What unit?" Harold answered without hesitation. 3rd Armored Division. The coffee cup slipped from Robert's trembling hand and shattered on the hardwood floor. Everyone turned toward them. Jason frowned. "Dad, what are you doing?" But Robert didn't answer. Instead, he took another slow step closer. "What was your rank?" Harold remained silent for a moment before replying. "At that time, Colonel." Robert's eyes filled with tears. "No, it can't be." Emily looked from her father to Robert, completely confused. "Dad, what's happening?" Robert ignored the question. He stared at Harold as if trying to confirm a memory buried for decades. "There was an explosion during a rescue mission," Robert said softly. "The convoy was trapped." Harold nodded. "I remember. My vehicle was hit. I remember. I couldn't move. I remember that too." Robert's voice cracked. "Someone ran through enemy fire, pulled me out, and carried me to safety." Harold looked into the fireplace for a few seconds. Then he quietly smiled. "We were soldiers." Jason laughed nervously. "Wait, are you two seriously talking about something that happened over 30 years ago?" Neither man looked at him. Robert suddenly grabbed Harold's shoulders. "It was you." Harold didn't answer. "It was you." The room became silent once again. Robert's wife covered her mouth in shock. Emily had never seen her father talk about his military life. Not once. Jason crossed his arms. "So, he helped you years ago." "That's nice." Robert turned around so quickly that Jason stepped back. "Nice?" His voice echoed through the living room. "That man saved my life." Jason blinked. Robert continued. "I was 26 years old. I had already accepted that I was going to die." His eyes were wet. Everyone was ordered to retreat. But one officer refused. He ran back alone. He carried me nearly half a mile while bullets were flying everywhere. Robert looked at Harold again. "I owe every Christmas I've ever celebrated to him." Nobody spoke. Jason's confident smile slowly disappeared. Emily looked at her father with tears in her eyes. "Dad." Harold gently shook his head. "It was my duty." Robert couldn't believe how humble the old man remained. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" Harold smiled softly. "Because real service isn't something you use to impress people." Those words struck everyone at the table. Especially Jason. For the first time that evening, he felt a small sting of guilt. But he still had no idea who Harold Thompson truly was. He thought his father-in-law had simply been a retired colonel. What he didn't know was that Harold's military career had gone far beyond that battlefield. A career that had earned him some of the nation's highest honors. And hidden inside the leather folder resting quietly in Harold's apartment was a secret that would leave the entire Carter family speechless before Christmas morning. No one spoke for nearly a minute. The only sound in the room came from the crackling fire and the soft Christmas music playing in the background. Jason forced a smile, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, that's an incredible story. I had no idea you two knew each other." Robert slowly turned toward his son. "You don't understand, Jason. I understand that Grandpa Harold saved your life." Robert shook his head. "No, you don't." He looked back at Harold. "There was something different about you, even back then. Every soldier respected you." Harold lowered his eyes. That was a long time ago. Robert sighed. Some people never stop being leaders. Emily gently held her father's hand. Dad, why have you never told me any of this? Harold smiled warmly. Because I wanted you to know me as your father, not as a soldier. Emily's eyes filled with tears. I wish Mom were here to hear this. So do I, Harold whispered. Jason, still uncomfortable, picked up his coffee and laughed awkwardly. I guess I underestimated my father-in-law. Harold looked at him calmly. It's easy to underestimate people when you only see what's on the outside. Jason looked away. For the first time, those words stayed with him. A few minutes later everyone moved into the family room to exchange Christmas gifts. Boxes wrapped in bright paper covered the floor beneath the Christmas tree. Jason proudly handed out expensive watches, handbags, and electronic gadgets. Everyone applauded his generosity. When it was Harold's turn, he quietly reached into the inside pocket of his old brown coat. Instead of a large gift box, he placed a single white envelope on the table. Jason raised an eyebrow. Just an envelope? Harold smiled. Sometimes the smallest gifts carry the greatest meaning. Jason shrugged. I suppose. Harold slid the envelope toward Robert. I've kept this for over 30 years. Robert looked surprised. For me. Open it. With careful hands, Robert opened the envelope. Inside was an old black and white photograph. It showed two young soldiers standing beside a damaged military vehicle, smiling despite the destruction around them. Robert's hands began to shake. I thought this picture was lost forever. Harold nodded. I found it while cleaning my apartment last month. Robert stared at the photograph for a long moment before standing up. Without saying a word, he embraced Harold tightly. The room watched in silence. Jason had never seen his father cry. Not once in his entire life. Yet now tears rolled freely down Robert's face. You never forgot me, Robert whispered. Harold smiled. A soldier never forgets the people he served beside. Emily quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Even Jason's mother became emotional. Jason remained silent. Something inside him had begun to change. The old man he had mocked only hours earlier possessed a dignity that money could never buy. Just then, Robert looked again at the military insignia on Harold's coat. His eyes widened. He suddenly remembered another detail from those years. A name. A title. One that every young soldier had spoken with admiration. Robert slowly looked up. His voice trembled. Harold. Were you later promoted after that mission? Harold remained silent. Robert swallowed hard. Were you eventually appointed General Thompson? The room froze. Jason laughed nervously. A general? Seriously? Harold looked at Robert for several seconds. Then, with quiet humility, he gave a small nod. Yes. The smile disappeared from Jason's face. He had just realized. The man he had spent the entire evening mocking wasn't just an ordinary retired veteran. He had been one of the most respected military leaders in the country. And that revelation was only the beginning. Jason stared at Harold as if he were looking at a completely different person. A general, he asked quietly. Harold simply nodded. I retired many years ago. The room remained silent. Jason couldn't believe it. The man he had mocked all evening had once commanded thousands of soldiers. Yet he had never mentioned it, never tried to impress anyone, and never demanded respect. Robert took a deep breath. You weren't just a general, he said. You became one of the youngest 4-star generals in the army. Every officer knew your name. Emily looked at her father in disbelief. Dad, is that true? Harold smiled gently. I was fortunate to serve with brave men and women. You always say, we, Robert replied. You never say, I. That's what made everyone respect you. Jason slowly sat down on the couch. He remembered every sarcastic comment he had made that evening. Nice coat. Careful with those expensive cups. Simple dreams for a simple life. Each sentence now echoed in his mind like a painful reminder of his own arrogance. Emily looked at her husband. Jason, do you have something to say? He opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. For the first time in years, his confidence had disappeared. Meanwhile, Robert carefully unfolded another piece of paper that had been inside the white envelope. It was an old newspaper clipping. Across the top was a faded headline. Army General Harold Thompson awarded the Medal of Honor for extraordinary leadership. Everyone around the room leaned closer. Jason read the article silently. It described how General Harold Thompson had refused to abandon injured soldiers during a dangerous overseas mission. Despite heavy enemy fire, he led multiple rescue operations, saving dozens of lives. At the bottom of the article was a photograph of a much younger Harold standing beside the President of the United States, receiving the nation's highest military honor. Jason looked from the newspaper to the quiet old man sitting beside the fireplace. You never told anyone? Harold smiled. People who truly know me don't need to hear my achievements. Robert added. After receiving the medal, reporters followed him everywhere. Television stations wanted interviews. Publishers offered him book deals. So why didn't you accept them? Emily asked. Harold looked toward the Christmas tree. Because fame doesn't last forever. Character does. Those words settled heavily over the room. Jason lowered his head. He suddenly realized that everything he had spent his life chasing, expensive cars, designer suits, luxury homes, meant very little compared to the quiet dignity sitting only a few feet away. After a long silence, Jason slowly stood up. He walked toward Harold. I'm ashamed. Harold looked at him with kind eyes. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. Jason's voice trembled. I judged you because of your clothes. I assumed your value by your bank account. I never even tried to know who you really were. Harold gently placed a hand on Jason's shoulder. We all make mistakes. Jason shook his head. No. I chose pride. Tears filled Emily's eyes as she watched the two men. She had prayed for years that her husband would learn humility. Perhaps tonight was the answer. But Harold had one final surprise waiting. Back in his apartment, inside the old wooden chest, was a sealed document that no member of his family had ever. The Carter family sat in complete silence. No one cared about the expensive gifts anymore. No one talked about business, luxury cars, or vacation homes. Every eye was on Harold Thompson. Jason finally broke the silence. Why did you never tell Emily that you were a 4-star general? Why hide everything? Harold smiled softly. Because titles belong to the past. Character belongs to the present. Jason lowered his head. But people would have respected you. Harold looked directly into his eyes. If respect only comes after hearing my title, then it isn't respect. It's admiration for status. Those words struck Jason harder than any criticism ever could. After dessert, the family gathered around the fireplace. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the neighborhood in white. Emily quietly sat beside her father. Dad, were you lonely after Mom passed away? Harold looked at the flames dancing in the fireplace. Very. I thought about selling everything and moving away. Emily squeezed his hand. Why didn't you tell me? Because you had your own family to build. Your mother always wanted you to live your own life, not spend it worrying about us. Emily couldn't hold back her tears. I'm sorry. Harold gently wiped a tear from her cheek. There is nothing to apologize for. Meanwhile, Robert walked into his study and returned carrying an old military album. He placed it on the coffee table. "I've kept this for over 30 years. Inside were photographs of young soldiers, training camps, military ceremonies, rescue missions." Suddenly Robert stopped at one photograph. There. Everyone leaned closer. It showed a much younger Harold standing in front of hundreds of soldiers. Even then, he looked calm and humble. Jason stared at the picture. "I can't believe this is the same man." Robert smiled. "It is. And nothing about him has changed except his age." Jason slowly stood and walked toward the window. He looked outside at the falling snow. For years, he had believed success could be measured by money. Tonight that belief was falling apart. Without turning around he quietly asked, "Harold, why did you wear that old brown coat?" The room became silent again. Harold looked down at the worn sleeves. He gently brushed away an invisible speck of dust. "This coat belonged to the day I buried my wife." Emily looked up in surprise. Harold continued, "Margaret bought it for me 22 Christmases ago. It was the last Christmas gift she ever gave me before cancer changed our lives." Emily covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face. "I wear it every Christmas because it reminds me that love is worth more than anything money can buy." No one spoke. Jason felt his chest tighten. He had laughed at the very coat that carried the most precious memory of Harold's life. Slowly, he walked over to Harold. With tears in his eyes, he said, "I'm sorry, not because you're a general. I'm sorry because I forgot how to be a decent human being." Harold stood and embraced him. "I forgive you." Robert smiled proudly. This is what Christmas is really about. But before the evening ended, Harold quietly reached into his pocket and removed a small brass key. He placed it on the table. Jason looked confused. "What does this key open?" Harold smiled. "It opens something I've kept locked for 5 years. A place your mother-in-law wanted all of you to see one day. No one knew that by sunrise, that key would unlock a secret that would change the Carter family forever." Christmas morning arrived with a blanket of fresh snow covering Cedar Falls. The previous night's emotional dinner had changed something inside everyone, especially Jason. No one mentioned the arguments from the night before. Instead, everyone was curious about the small brass key Harold had placed on the table. Jason finally asked, "Harold, where does this key lead?" Harold slipped the key back into his pocket and smiled. "Come with me. It's time." Within an hour, the entire Carter family followed Harold's old pickup truck out of town. Jason was surprised that the truck was over 20 years old, yet it ran perfectly. After a 40-minute drive through snow-covered roads, they arrived at a quiet lakeside property surrounded by tall pine trees. In the middle stood a beautiful wooden cabin. Emily stared in disbelief. "Dad! I've never seen this place before." Harold nodded. "Your mother and I bought this land 30 years ago. We dreamed of growing old here together." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "But after she became sick, we never had the chance." Harold inserted the brass key into the front door. The lock clicked open. As everyone stepped inside, they found the cabin exactly as Margaret had left it. A warm stone fireplace. Handmade Christmas decorations. Family photographs on every wall. A rocking chair beside the window. Even Margaret's favorite knitted blanket was folded neatly across the chair. It felt as though time had stood still. Emily walked slowly through the living room, touching each photograph with trembling hands. "I can't believe you kept everything exactly the same." Harold smiled softly. "Every memory in this house reminds me of your mother." Jason looked around silently. He had expected an abandoned cabin. Instead, he found a home filled with love. Robert noticed several framed military medals hanging in a hallway. "Harold, these belong in a museum." Harold shook his head. "They belong here. Margaret was always more proud of them than I ever was." Emily opened a small wooden cabinet. Inside were dozens of photo albums labeled by year. She picked up one marked Emily's childhood. Laughing through tears, she found pictures of birthday parties, fishing trips, Christmas mornings, and school concerts. "Dad, you saved everything. I never wanted to forget a single moment." Jason quietly stepped outside onto the snow-covered porch. Looking across the frozen lake, he realized something painful. For years, he had measured wealth by money. But Harold possessed something far more valuable. A lifetime of memories. A loving marriage. A respected career. And a daughter who adored him. Jason whispered to himself. "I was the poor one, not him." Just then, Harold joined him on the porch. Without looking at Jason, he quietly said, "Money builds houses." He paused. "But love builds homes." Jason couldn't hold back his tears anymore. "I'm sorry for everything." Harold placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "The greatest strength isn't never making mistakes. It's having the courage to admit them." Jason nodded. "I want to become that kind of man." Harold smiled. "You already took the first step." Just then, Emily called everyone back inside. "Dad, there's another locked box here." Harold looked toward the old wooden chest sitting beneath the Christmas tree. He took a slow breath. "I've waited 5 years to open that box." "What is inside?" Robert asked. Harold looked at the family gathered around him and quietly replied. "Margaret's final Christmas letter." The room fell silent. No one knew that the words written in that letter would change the Carter family forever. The cabin became completely silent. Outside, snowflakes drifted gently onto the frozen lake, while inside, everyone gathered around the old wooden chest beneath the Christmas tree. Harold slowly knelt beside it. His hands trembled as he unlocked the small brass lock. "I haven't opened this since the day Margaret passed away," he whispered. Emily held her breath. Harold carefully lifted the lid. Inside were neatly folded baby clothes, old Christmas ornaments, family photo albums, a silver wedding ring, and a cream-colored envelope. Across the front, written in Margaret's elegant handwriting, were the words, "To my family. Open on the Christmas when your hearts are ready." Emily burst into tears. "Dad! Mom wrote this?" Harold nodded quietly. "I wasn't strong enough to read it before today." He gently handed the letter to Emily. "No. Mom wanted you to read it," Emily said softly. Harold unfolded the letter with shaking hands. His voice was calm, but filled with emotion. "My dearest Harold, Emily, and the family that will one day grow around you. If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to celebrate Christmas with you. Please don't spend your lives mourning me. Instead, laugh louder, hug longer, and forgive faster. Harold. I know you'll hide your pain behind that quiet smile of yours. Please don't spend the rest of your life alone. And promise me one more thing. Never let people change the kindness inside your heart. Some people will judge you by your clothes. Others will judge you by your money. But the people worth keeping will always judge you by your character. Emily. Take care of your father. One day you'll realize he has sacrificed far more than he'll ever admit. And if your husband is reading this, love isn't measured by the size of a house. It's measured by how safe someone feels when they're beside you. Finally, every Christmas, leave one empty chair at the table. Not because I'm gone, but because love never truly leaves a family. I'll always be with you. Love forever, Margaret. By the time Harold finished reading, tears covered every face in the room. Emily hugged her father tightly. I miss her so much. So do I, Harold whispered. Jason quietly walked to the empty chair beside the fireplace. Without saying a word, he gently pulled it closer to the Christmas table. This chair belongs to Margaret, he said. Every Christmas, it will stay here. Harold looked at Jason with pride. Margaret's wish had come true. Jason was no longer thinking like a wealthy businessman. He was thinking like family. Robert wiped away his tears. Margaret was an extraordinary woman. Harold smiled. She made me a better man every single day. Just then, Emily noticed another envelope hidden beneath the letter. Dad, there's one more. Harold looked surprised. I don't remember seeing that before. He opened it carefully. Inside was a folded legal document. Attached to it was a handwritten note from Margaret. Harold. When the family finally learns that love is more valuable than money, it's time to tell them about our final gift. Jason looked confused. What final gift? Harold slowly unfolded the document. As soon as Robert saw the first page, his eyes widened in shock. He whispered. My God! This property isn't the only thing you own. Harold quietly nodded. No. And what I'm about to tell all of you, will change every one of your lives forever. No one spoke. Harold carefully placed the document on the dining table inside the cabin. Outside, snow continued falling, but inside, every heartbeat seemed louder than the wind. Jason looked at the papers. What is it? Harold took a slow breath. 5 years ago, after Margaret passed away, I sold several investments that we had quietly built over our lifetime. Emily looked surprised. Investments? Harold nodded. Your mother and I never lived extravagantly. We saved, invested, and planned for decades. Robert slowly turned the pages. His eyes grew wider with every document. This isn't possible. Jason leaned closer. What is it? Robert looked directly at him. Harold owns this cabin, 3 apartment buildings, farmland outside Cedar Falls, and a large investment portfolio. Jason's face turned pale. How much? Harold answered calmly. I've never cared about the number. Robert spoke softly. It's worth well over $20 million. The room fell silent. Emily stared at her father in complete disbelief. Dad, why did you live in that tiny apartment? Harold smiled gently. Because I only needed 1 chair to read my books, 1 kitchen to cook my meals, and 1 bedroom to remember your mother. Emily began crying again. You could have lived anywhere. I already lived where my happiest memories were. Jason couldn't even look at Harold anymore. Every sarcastic joke he had made felt heavier than ever. He whispered. I treated a millionaire like he was worthless. Harold shook his head. No. You treated a human being like he was worthless. Those words hit Jason harder than anything else. He slowly walked across the room. Then, in front of everyone, he knelt down. I'm ashamed of myself. I judged you by your clothes. I judged you by your home. I judged you by what I thought you owned. Harold gently helped him stand. I never wanted an apology. I wanted you to learn. Jason nodded through tears. And I have. Harold smiled. Then this Christmas has already given me the greatest gift. A few moments later, Harold picked up another envelope from the table. This one was written by me. He handed it to Emily. She opened it carefully. Inside was a legal document naming her as the future trustee of the family's charitable foundation. Emily looked confused. A foundation? Harold nodded. Your mother always dreamed that our savings would help people after we were gone. The document explained the creation of the Margaret Thompson Foundation, dedicated to helping military veterans, widows, and children who could not afford an education. Jason looked at Harold in amazement. You're giving most of your wealth away. Harold smiled. We brought nothing into this world. We'll take nothing with us. If our blessings can become someone else's second chance, then your mother and I have succeeded. Robert wiped away another tear. I've met wealthy men. But today I've met a truly rich man. Harold quietly looked at the photograph of Margaret hanging above the fireplace. I promised her that money would never become our family's master. Then he turned back toward everyone. There is only one thing left to do. Jason asked. What is that? Harold reached into his coat pocket and removed one final sealed envelope. I've made one last decision. And tomorrow morning, I'll tell all of you who will inherit everything I own. Everyone exchanged nervous glances. No one knew what Harold had decided. But his final choice would surprise them more than anything that had happened so. Christmas morning sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, making the fresh snow outside sparkle like thousands of tiny diamonds. No one had slept much the night before. Harold's final sealed envelope sat quietly on the dining table. Everyone wondered what it contained. Emily poured coffee for the family while Jason remained unusually quiet. The arrogant businessman from the previous evening seemed like a completely different man. Harold finally picked up the envelope. This is the last thing your mother and I prepared together, he said softly. He opened it and removed a neatly folded document. It isn't a will, he explained. It's a letter. Emily smiled through her tears. From you? Harold nodded. Yes. He began reading. To my beloved family. If you're hearing these words, it means you've already discovered the truth that your mother and I hoped you would one day understand. Money can build comfort, but it can never replace kindness. Titles earn attention, but humility earns respect. Never judge a person by an old coat, an old car, or a small home. The richest people are often the ones who never feel the need to prove they are rich. Jason. If you're standing beside Emily while this letter is being read, then I know you've changed. Take care of my daughter. Not with expensive gifts, but with patience, honesty, and love. Emily. You've always been my greatest blessing. Keep this family together, even when life becomes difficult. And remember, forgiveness is the greatest inheritance anyone can leave behind. Harold folded the letter and looked around the room. I've made my decision. Everyone listened carefully. My properties, investments, and everything I own will be placed in a family trust. Jason looked surprised. Harold continued. Emily will oversee the trust. The income will continue supporting the Margaret Thompson Foundation, helping veterans, widows, and children in need. He paused before smiling. And this cabin? He looked around the room filled with memories. Will never be sold. Emily asked softly. Why? Harold's eyes rested on the old rocking chair where Margaret had once spent countless Christmas evenings. Because this house isn't worth millions of dollars. It's worth every memory we created together. Jason slowly stood. He walked toward Harold. With tears in his eyes, he embraced his father-in-law. I came into Christmas thinking success meant wealth. You've taught me that success means becoming the kind of person others can trust. Harold smiled warmly. Then your greatest promotion happened today. Robert laughed through his tears. I think Margaret would be smiling right now. I know she is, Harold replied. Before leaving the cabin, Jason noticed Harold's old brown coat hanging beside the front door. He carefully picked it up and handed it to him. This isn't an old coat anymore. It's a reminder that I should never judge another person again. Harold put on the coat and gently patted Jason's shoulder. And that's why I wore it. It wasn't to test who respected a general. It was to discover who could respect an ordinary old man. Everyone stood in silence. Outside, church bells began ringing across the snow-covered valley. For the first time in years, the Carter family wasn't thinking about money, status, or success. They were thinking about gratitude. As they walked out of the cabin together, Emily slipped her hand into her father's. Jason walked beside them, no longer embarrassed by Harold's old coat, but proud to walk next to the man who wore it. Some people inherit money. Some inherit property. But that Christmas, the Carter family inherited something far more valuable. Humility. Compassion. Forgiveness. And the understanding that a person's true worth can never be measured by what they wear or what they own. The end.